So now we come to that uncomfortable point at the beginning of a message just after a certain gospel lesson comes every year. That uncomfortable pause when everyone's wondering, okay, is the pastor going to do it this time? Is he going to talk about money? Is he going to talk about tithing and those things that make us uncomfortable and start to squirm around in our seats? And I come in, and I don't know if it adds extra discomfort or less discomfort, but coming in as the guest preacher, right? So you won't see me afterwards. And so if I talk about this, there's no obligation. I'm not passing this on to Pastor James or something like that. And I can also reassure you that Pastor James did not give me any words that he wanted to secretly say through me, okay? And so if you want to talk about him afterwards, that's fine, right? But yeah, this is not his message through me or something like that either. It's God's message to us today. Now, the important point to make here is that, yes, this sermon is going to be about money, and we are going to be focusing on the gospel lesson for today. But today's gospel lesson is not, and I'll say this again, is not, and I'll say this one more time, is not just about tithing and giving to the church. But it does focus largely on money and our relationship with money, and how our relationship with money speaks to our relationship with God. And you probably heard it before. Jesus likes to talk about money. He does it over and over in the gospel, but it's not just because he is particularly focused on that one issue. It's because money is one of many things that he talks about very many times, because it reveals so much about our relationship with God, and because for so many of us, myself included, it can easily be a stumbling block. And so it's just one of many pet topics that Jesus has. Anything that people can put their trust in instead of him, Jesus will talk about, and talk about a lot. Now, it's an interesting scripture lesson that we have appointed for us today from Mark. And a lot of times our instinct is to go straight to the widow and her mite, and it's probably an instinct a lot of times for the pastor to go straight to the widow and the mite, because that's about giving to what? Church, right? It looks like it's giving to church, even though it was the temple back then in a little different context, and we'll get into a little bits of that. But that's not where I want to start. I actually want to start with the section that comes up right before it, where Jesus is giving this warning, okay? Because you can't really separate the two, because it's all wrapped together, and that's why they do a good job with this pericope, this reading, to put it together. So let's look at verses 38 to 40. This is Jesus teaching to the crowds this last week of his life, right? Before the crucifixion. As he taught, Jesus said, "Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted in the marketplace and have the most important seats in the synagogue and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. Such men will be punished most severely." So he actually starts with not a warning to regular folks, but this warning to the scribes, right? And it's not just that they're the only people that could do these kinds of things, but what he's saying is, I have a warning for people who make a pretense out of religion, who love all the outward forms, but what's going on inside their hearts doesn't match up. And this is a theme that Jesus likes again many, many times. What's interesting is that his greatest condemnation for them is about what? Devouring the widow's houses. That they make this pretense of love and care and compassion by being this teacher and by going around and making the lengthy prayers on behalf of all the people in the temple, in that church type of community. But then while they're doing that on the outside, inside, and when people aren't noticing, they're devouring the widows' houses. And remember, when we're talking about widows, we need to understand who the widows were back then, right? Widows were the edge of society. They were at the lowest realm of the socioeconomic class. They were vulnerable. They did not have their husbands anymore. They didn't have their husband's economic might next to them anymore. Their inheritances were often in doubt then when they lost their husband. If they didn't have kids, if they weren't blessed by children from that marriage, then they had lost that other economic support. And a lot of times when they talk about the widows, that's who they're talking about, the ones who lost their husbands and who were not blessed with children underneath them then either. They were the edge. It also talks about orphans and aliens. Those are other classes a lot of times that God will point out as well. And there were all these laws, remember, in Israelite society to protect those at these edges. You'll remember the story of Ruth, right? Everyone loves that story of Ruth. You know, she is a widow and her mother-in-law is a widow, and they go back into the land. And remember, there's laws set up to protect them, right? When they get back into the land, do you remember what Naomi tells Ruth to go do? Go to that field, right? and go to that field and see the way they set it up was that those who own land, they were given certain rules about how much they could gather. You can gather everything, but only this close to the edge of the field. And this portion you need to leave for the widows and the aliens and the other people that are at the edge of society and don't have land to come and get grain, okay? And when your reapers are going through, anything that drops, they're hacking stuff and they gather it and some drops to the ground. You can't pick that up. That's for the widows and the aliens and those who don't have otherwise. There were all these things that were set up as these social supports, the social safety net, if you will, to take care of those people at the edges of society. And church and state were all kind of mixed together in their mind then to do that. And they set up these rather complicated formulas for the tithe and what was appropriate to set aside at the temple, if you will, and what was supposed to stay close to the community to, again, take care of those people at the edges of society or those people who weren't provided for otherwise. Right? And so this is the context into which Jesus is reading, a society that looks at things and sees these, that has these laws that are set up to take care of the poor and the impoverished, these people that Jesus says God cares about so much. And so into that context, then he talks to them and says, one of the things I condemn most is those who devour the widow's houses. What does that mean then precisely? Well, there's a couple theories about what devouring the widow's houses means. One of the theories is that some of the women who were widows in this society would go to the temple or go to the church body of that time, would go to the teachers of the law, and they would say, okay, whatever inheritance I do have, my home, my land, whatever I am entrusted with, I give over to you. You just take care of me. And then what Jesus is condemning is the practice of the temple and the chief priests and all those people taking that land underneath their wing and then maybe taking care of the widows at the base level, but taking care of themselves most lavishly. The other theory is that those who were teachers and preaching to the people, including to the widows and those at the edge, would sit there and preach giving and preach giving and preach giving and giving until it hurts and trying to basically soak every single last dollar out of them. And both of those theories have a lot of merit to it. Devouring widows' houses sounds a lot like the first theory. And the second theory about preaching to the people to give even beyond their means sounds a little bit like, maybe the pressure that this widow was under, in the next little piece of this text, right? And you know what? To some degree, it doesn't really matter which one is absolutely correct, because the heart of what Jesus is saying is true either way, that there's a twofold problem to the people he's talking to. And the first problem is that they don't trust. The problem is that they don't trust God in relation to money. You see, what he's saying is whether you're a landowner sitting there looking at your fields and thinking, if I just go a little bit closer to the edge of that field, how much more am I going to bring in? And in a large field and all that grain, wow, think about how much more I could make. And when people aren't noticing, maybe we could gather up a little bit of that grain that's been spilled on the field before everyone else rushes in to get it, because how much more could I make? But I won't do it, because I know that's not what God would desire. That's an issue of trust, right? Am I going to try to get as much as I can, or am I going to leave because I know how God wants to use it? Or to the teacher then, am I going to preach to that person to give beyond their means because that makes me a little bit more comfortable? Or am I going to use the resources that they put into our trust in a way that allows me to live it up a little bit more because that's what I want for me? Or am I going to preach in a way that honors God and that talks about sacrificial giving but doesn't tell a person to go beyond their means because I know that honors God? The person who was approaching the temple and thinking about their tithe, saying, okay, how much should I give? Is there a way I can manipulate things such that my 10% looks a little bit smaller than maybe it should? Or should I give as God has given me because I trust God? You see, that was the problem he was talking about. It was an issue of trust. The person who looked at their fields and just left what was there because that's what God said says, that's all right, God's given me enough, I can trust. The teacher who just taught appropriately about the tithe was trusting because that's what God wanted. The person who was giving the tithe just straight up off what they had seen as honestly as they possibly could was just giving as God wanted because they trusted God had given them enough so that they could take care of themselves and take care of all the other people that God said, I can take care of them all with what I have given to you as well. They were building a relationship with God and the people around and seeing it all connected. But the other problem that he was confronting them on then was an issue of greed, right? He's also confronting them on their greed. To eat up the widow's houses, literally, the word devour there is a pretty good translation, because literally the Greek behind it is to eat up completely, to consume completely and leave nothing left over. And so devour, I think, kind of gets that connotation out really, really well. He's getting at the hearts of these people who not only distrust God to provide then, but who also love what the money gets them. They love the flowing robes, if you will, and the best seats at the banquets where they get to eat the rich and the lavish food. They love the power and the prestige that comes along with the money and with their position, because that's what makes them feel good. And that's upside down, isn't it? Because God says it's not the stuff that should make you feel good. It's relationship with me and caring for others that should make you feel good. Now, the good news then is that we can all breathe easily, right? Because I'm guessing no one here has bilked any widows out of their houses down the street, right? No one's taken away any widows' houses anytime. No widow has turned her property over to you and said, take care of it completely, or something like that. So if you haven't done that, you're probably pretty good, right? And I don't know if there's any farmers in the house here anymore or not, but even if you were a farmer, there's no laws really set up anymore to say, leave the last few rows of grain for the poor to come in and gather up, and don't gather stuff off the ground that may have been dropped because there's impoverished people that need to come and pick it up, right? No one's got any fields that there's people lined up to go and grab any grain afterwards, right? No? Okay, so as long as you don't fall in those categories, can you breathe easily then? This text doesn't apply? Yeah, I know we obviously set those kinds of things up. But it's important to do so because, the principle obviously remains. And sometimes it's easy to excuse ourselves when we see the words and say, okay, even if we're not saying it verbally to ourselves, kind of in our head there's this line of reasoning that doesn't really apply to me. I don't do those kinds of things. I don't take advantage of widows. And yet this principle of caring for the poor obviously still applies to us. This issue of trust continues to apply to us. When I give to the church, is there that note of, do I really want to give that much? How much do I really need to give to the church? And if I'm in this kind of financial time, does that mean I can give a little bit less this time right now or something like that? Can I manipulate my numbers and think about my tithe in a little different way, right? And that starts to point out to us an issue of trust, right? And it actually gets a little bit more complicated for us because in the Old Testament, they were said, give a tithe, give 10%. And like I said, they could play the numbers a little bit, but still the number they were supposed to give was what? 10%. Well, for us, we don't have the hard and fast number anymore where we can check off the box and say, hey, I gave 10%, I'm completely good with God, right? God actually mixes it up in the New Testament and says, give sacrificially, give as much as you can, and maybe even a little bit more. He sits there and he opens it up so you can't just check the box off anymore. And he makes it harder on us then. What should I give? How is God moving my heart and my spirit in relation to that? And we have to try to figure that out. And have I given enough in our church so that we can care for the poor as part of our responsibility to society? And are we here at Water of Life or our church back at Our Savior in McKinney or any church that we are members of, are we giving enough to the poor and the impoverished? Is that enough of a part of our mission? That's one of those hard questions that comes about on us again then too, isn't it? And then we start to look at the other applications too. Because like I said, church and state were kind of in one piece when God was talking to these people in these contexts. And today, they're not quite so wrapped up. But the state is still out there. And God still uses the state just like he did then. And so, oh my goodness, does that mean all of a sudden that my taxes are part of this too? Yes. That feeling that I get about the government, and the IRS, right? Taking my money. Well, wait a second, whose money is it? It's not the government's money, I'm not saying that. But it's God's money, isn't it? And so that resentment we feel at the government for using the money, and I'm not going to get into politics and pick one side of the aisle or the other side of the aisle, and I'm not saying you guys are on the left or you guys are on the right, okay? I'm not trying to advocate any certain policies. But what I'm looking at is our hearts that say, the government is still there, and God does still use the government to take care of the poor amongst many other things that he does through the government. And so we still need to care, and I certainly would hope both political parties would care about that money and be trying to figure out what is the best way to use this money that God has given us and that goes through the government to take care of the poor and the disenfranchised. And so it's our responsibility all of a sudden to care about that with our vote and with our money, and not to resent the money that we do give to the state, because God is doing something with it, or he intends to do something with it. And then, as we come to the close of the year, I'm sure y'all are getting lots of letters, aren't you, in the mail? Lots of letters from charities and nonprofits, kind of like the one I work for, sending you something saying, as you consider your end of the year giving, we hope that you will consider us. And sometimes it's easy to sit there and see letter after letter after letter, and almost you start to feel like, come on, haven't you had enough? Give it up. But for us to start to think, what is that saying about my heart? Not that we can give to every single letter that comes in the mailbox. I understand that. But this attitude in our hearts of saying, wait a second, these nonprofits, these charities are, again, ways that God has set up our society to care for the edges. And to be thankful for what they're doing rather than say, oh my goodness, another letter, right? And so God does start to make us look into our hearts and to start to figure out, am I trusting God? And am I seeing it all as God's, a portion of which I return to him? Or is it mine? Is it mine? And I want to keep a hold of as much of it to make sure that I take care of every single little thing. And then maybe what's left over can go to the charity. Maybe what's left over can go to the church. Maybe what's left over, well, okay, the government gets its share, right? But then it also makes us think about that second issue of greed then too, right? Am I a little bit too in love with the latest gadgets or the nicest car or the biggest host that I can possibly have in this time of year? Then am I a little more focused on making sure that I've got more and more and more to give the most lavish gifts possible? And giving seems like such a good thing, right? Gifts seem like such a good thing, and I'm not saying they're bad, but so much of it stays so close to home, doesn't it? And maybe not as much going out to those edges of society. And so it starts to reveal certain things about our heart. Can leave us with that pit in our stomach sometimes, can't it? Anytime we talk about money or those things that tinge at our hearts a little bit, it can start to leave us with one of those little pits. Those guilty feelings that make us sit there and analyze that last transaction that we did, that last time we gave or did not give, and all those kinds of pieces rolling around. My hope and my prayer is that as we walk through the rest of this text, that we start to see that while talking about money can leave a pit in our stomach, it can also produce a sense of joy inside us. That there can start to be this bubbling up of joy and of peace and of happiness as we talk about money. And that's not the way we're used to thinking about it normally, at least not in the non-greedy sense of thinking about it. But the sense of giving can start to produce a joy in us. And if we look at verses 41 to 44, if we go into the story of the widow's mite, I think we can start to see that. Listen again. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put, and he watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. And many rich people threw in large amounts. But a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a fraction of a penny. And calling the disciples to him, Jesus said, I tell you the truth, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They gave out of their wealth, but she gave out of her poverty, out of her lack, out of the little that she had. I mean, it's interesting to think about that widow then, isn't it? She doesn't seem scared, does she? You know, the rich people are giving out of their wealth. They still have a lot left over, is what Jesus is saying. They give out of how much extra they have, is kind of the connotation behind the Greek. Whereas behind the Greek with the widow, she gave out of her lack. She gave when she had very little to go on, right? And yet she doesn't seem to be worried about it. She hasn't diced it up. She puts in how many copper coins? 2. She could have given just 1, right? She could have said, okay, I'll give you that one, God, but I'm going to save this one. She says, no, this is what God has moved my heart to give right now, and I trust in God. He has given me enough to live on up to this point in time, even if it isn't a lot. Even if it isn't a lot by the standards of all those wealthy people that she must see throwing in lots of money there. She could easily say in her head, right? Because remember, this is a real story. This is not a parable. That's important for us to understand. This is a real story, not a parable. Jesus observing live people going and doing things, and he's calling his attention, the attention of the disciples to real live people, okay? She could as easily have said, these 2 coins mean nothing to the church. Those wealthy people have outgiven me with one of the coins that they put in. Why bother? God, I'm just going to keep what I have. But she's got an attitude of trust. And she says, God, you have apparently trusted me with some money. And it's yours, God. And so all I'm doing is giving you some back. And that's going to a relationship of discipleship, right? Casting aside everything and saying, hey, God, let's see what you can do with what we all give, right? Because it's all yours. Everything around me in creation, God, is yours. The food that I eat, the clothes that I wear, and the money that you have given me, God, it's all yours. Whatever you've entrusted me with, I'm just a poor steward of it. That apparently is what's going on in the widow's heart. And so, God, let's see what you can do with what those guys gave, but what you can do with these couple of copper coins too. I'm excited to see it. That's what I'm imagining must be the widow's thinking as she sees and says, yes, let me add my portion to the contribution too. And she's giving because she gets to give in response to how much God has given her. And you might say, wait a second, she's got almost nothing, but she still sees that she's giving in response to what God's given her, both in terms of material blessings, but then also in terms of spiritual blessing. And remember, again, like I said, this is not a parable. This is a live story watching real people. And this is Jesus preaching in the last week of his life, sitting there in the temple. And that last week of his life, all those people coming in the temple, what were they getting ready for? What feast were they getting ready for? Does anyone remember? What is it? Passover, right? They were getting ready for Passover, and you can't divorce that from the context, okay? They were getting ready for Passover, and the Passover is the greatest feast in their entire year. It is the high point of their spiritual year where they remember what? That God is the best giver of all because he took them when they were slaves in Egypt. And he pulled them out with his mighty right hand, and he brought them through the seas that were parted, and he saved them from Pharaoh's armies, and then he brought them to a land flowing with milk and honey. God is a saver and God is a giver. And is he a stingy giver? He's a gracious giver. And they're remembering spiritually that he had saved them. That when all the other Egyptians were losing their firstborns, he passed over their houses and saved them. God is a gracious giver in terms of wealth and things around us and material things, but also of salvation. And so as that widow gives, she realizes God has given me enough to live on apparently, and he has given me more than enough inside my soul. And so yes, God, let me return a small piece of what you have given me to you to use as you please. And so in our giving, we need to be able to look at the money not with a pit in our stomach, but with a sense of joy and of discipleship and excitement about what God can do with what we have, what he's given into our hands, right? And I'm not saying that's going to be easy, right? There are going to be times in your life where you're like, oh, I'm squeezed, God. I mean, we've just been going through that the last couple months in our house because all of a sudden my wife got really, really sick with a bunch of kidney stones, and all of a sudden, wow, there goes the deductible, right? Oh, there goes the max out of pocket from the insurance company. Wow, okay, we weren't expecting that in the last couple months of the year. And oh, let's have a car die on us too, and let's go car shopping for a new car. And then you got all the regular expenses that don't stop. And so we've lived this in the last couple of months where, wow, okay, that was all unexpected. But yet, God's given us enough to live on. Doesn't mean it's always going to be easy. That doesn't mean the choices are always going to be easy. But God has given us enough. He's given us more than enough. He's given us far more than many people around the world. And so I am not going to be hesitant and recalcitrant to say, hey, those continued pledges that we have, we're going to continue to give, God, because you have always taken care of us. And so we're going to continue to give, knowing that you will continue to take care of us tomorrow too. And hopefully we can give with a joyful heart, saying, you know what, God, it's not mine in the first place. And so if I'm giving you 10% or whatever the number is, guess what? You can do more with the 90% left in my life and a trusting heart than me with a grudging, unfaithful heart trying to hold on to 100%. Because you are a gracious, gracious giver. And you have graciously poured your grace over me. And so I know that if you are a gracious giver, not one who says, oh, Dan, I'll forgive you for, this portion of your greed and now make up the rest by doing good works. No, God forgives us for it all with nothing on my part. Then that's got to form my whole relationship to him, doesn't it? He's poured out his grace on me. He's poured out possessions and material things on me too. And so I'm but a steward of those things. I'm a steward of his grace, and hopefully returning a portion of it to you today and offering us all to come up to the table today to receive his gracious, overpouring love and forgiveness for us, and greed and whatever other sins are in our life. And he's a gracious God who has given you people in your lives. He's given me my wife and my children to steward. And he's given me a job to steward. He's given you jobs to steward. And he's given us material possessions as well. And we're but stewards of those, entrusted with God's things, to use them for God's purposes, to care for the poor, to care for the needy, to care for our families, to care for our churches. And so I pray that we can do that with joy in our hearts, and that we can see money then too, not with a pit in our stomach, but with an attitude of saying, hey God, what do you get to do with this money today? And how can you grow me today in my relationship to you as we care for others? Amen. Amen. Let's stand now and confess our faith in that God, that incredible